The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried in by a rider whose horse was gray with dust and sweat. Grayson Holt read it standing in the study of his main house, a room built of thick timber and furnished with heavy mahogany that had been hauled overland at tremendous cost. The house was a fortress of wealth and solitude, and at 38, Grayson was master of all of it, and weary of its emptiness. The letter was from his sister, Eleanor, back in Philadelphia. Her handwriting was a frantic, looped scrawl that always set his teeth on edge. She was a woman who believed any problem, including her brother's stubborn loneliness, could be solved with brisk organization. My dearest Grayson, she has arrived. A month early. I told you Providence would smile on this. Miss Clara Dawson is currently in Wyoming. Grayson stopped reading, his gaze fixed on that line. He had agreed to this. In a moment of profound exhaustion 6 months prior, he had agreed to his sister's arrangement for a mail-order bride. He owned half the county, his herds numbered in the thousands, and he was tired of eating supper listening only to the sound of his own fork scraping a plate. He needed an heir. He needed, he supposed, a wife. But the reality of it, the arrival of a woman chosen from a catalog of references, now felt like a stone in his gut. He read on. She is a marvel. Grayson, from a fine Boston family, educated, quiet, and possessed of the highest moral character. All her references were impeccable. Impeccable. The word tasted sour. The last woman who had come into this house, the daughter of a Denver banker, had also been impeccable. She had charmed him for 3 months before he discovered she was plotting with his foreman to sell off a portion of his northern herd and claim the land patents for herself. He had sent her packing, and the foreman with her. He looked back at the letter. There was a small complication with her travel, and she has arrived well before you were meant to retrieve her. Ever resourceful, she has taken temporary shelter at the Miller Ranch, offering her services as a cook's assistant and laundress to earn her keep until the agreed-upon date. The Miller Ranch, that was 8 miles west, a smaller operation, run by a decent man named Arthur Miller, who was always in need of hands. Grayson crushed the letter in his fist. A woman of fine Boston family, working as a laundress. It did not ring true. It rang like a performance. A calculated display of humility meant to disarm him, the wealthy rancher, the target. She was showing him she was not afraid of work, showing him she was humble before she saw his house and calculated its worth. He'd seen this play before. Women who sought his name, his land, his money, hiding their sharp, greedy claws under soft gloves. His sister, bless her well-meaning heart, saw a bride. Grayson saw a threat. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the big house pressing in. He had agreed to meet her at the end of the month. He had agreed to ride into town, present himself as Grayson Holt, and collect her. He unfolded the letter, smoothing it on the desk. He would meet her, but not as Grayson Holt. If she was at the Miller Ranch, she did not yet know his face. She only knew his name and the rumors of his wealth. He would go to the Miller Ranch, but not as the man she was expecting. He would go as a man with nothing. He left the study and went not to his own wardrobe, but to the bunkhouse. The men were out on the range. He opened an empty locker, one kept for itinerant hands who might stay a week or two. He pulled out a pair of canvas trousers, worn thin at the knees and stained with grease. He found a flannel shirt, faded to a pale, indeterminate blue, and a hat that had been stepped on more than once. He shed his tailored shirt and trousers, dressing in the rough, scratching clothes. He looked at his reflection in a small, cracked mirror. His hands were calloused from work. He had built this ranch himself. He had never been a soft man, but his face was that of the owner. Shaved, severe, watchful. He had not shaved in 2 days. He rubbed the dark stubble on his jaw. It would do. He needed a name. Not Gray, too close. He thought of his grandfather's taciturn Smith, Silas, a solid, forgettable name, Silas Vance. He left his own ranch an hour later, riding his least conspicuous horse, a tough buckskin, leaving his foreman in charge with a vague story about checking boundary lines in the South. He rode toward the Miller place, not as a man going to greet his future, but as a spy infiltrating an enemy camp. Arthur Miller was a broad, tired man who was grateful for the offer of a strong back. "Looking for work," Grayson said, keeping his voice flat, pitching it lower. He stood in Miller's yard, holding the buckskin's reins. Miller squinted at him. "Can you mend fence? We're short." "I can." "Can you dig post holes without complaining?" "I can." "Bunkhouse is full," Miller said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "There's a dry lean-to by the smithy. You can bunk there. Pay is $1 a day and board. Supper's at 6. "Fair enough," Grayson said. He was Silas Vance, a broke laborer. He settled the horse and spent the afternoon in the biting wind, repairing a stretch of collapsed fencing on Miller's western edge. The work was hard, but it was familiar. It cleared his head. He was watching the sun begin to dip, staining the clouds a violent orange, when Miller's foreman called the men in. Grayson, as Silas, walked toward the modest ranch house, his shoulders aching. Men were washing dust from their faces and hands at a long trough near the porch. He joined them, the cold water stinging. The dining hall was a long, narrow room attached to the kitchen. It was loud, filled with the clatter of tin plates and the rough laughter of a dozen hands. Grayson took a plate and moved down the line. And then he saw her. She was not what he had expected, the women his sister paraded before him in Philadelphia, and the opportunists he'd met in Denver were soft, painted, and loud. This woman, Clara Dawson, was silent. She stood near the kitchen pass-through, refilling a large pot of coffee, her movements efficient and weary. She was tall, slender, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a beauty that was worn thin, like a fine piece of cloth rubbed raw. Her face was pale, and there were faint, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. She wore a simple gray dress, and her hands, when she gripped the coffee pot, were red and chapped. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the room, and for a moment it met his. Her eyes were gray, the color of the sky before a snow. There was no welcome in them, no flirtation. It was the look of a person surveying a room for threats, finding none, and looking away. She was polite, he observed, when one of the hands, a young man called Kid, said, "More coffee, Miss Dawson, if you please." She nodded, moved to his side, and poured. "Much obliged," Kid said, grinning at her. She gave a small, automatic nod and moved away, back to the relative safety of the kitchen doorway. She kept her distance. She did not invite conversation. She seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible, to occupy the least amount of space. Grayson sat, eating the stringy beef stew. He watched her. She worked without pause, clearing plates, refilling water, wiping down the heavy table. She seemed entirely focused on the work, as if it were a shield. He noticed she never spoke of her past, when Miller's wife, a kind, bustling woman, tried to draw her out. Clara's answers were brief and deflected. "You must find our Wyoming terribly rough after Boston, dear Mrs. Miller said. "It is very different, ma'am," Clara replied, her voice low. "And your family? Do you miss them terribly?" A flicker of something, pain, or perhaps just coldness, passed over Clara's face. "I have no family left, ma'am." "Oh, you poor dear, Mrs. Miller said, patting her arm. Clara flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, and stepped back. "If you'll excuse me, the kitchen needs cleaning." She fled. Grayson watched her go. This was not the behavior of a confident, high-society woman. This was the behavior of a refugee. The next few days settled into a routine. Grayson worked hard. He dug post holes until his palms blistered, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He split logs, he hauled feed, and he watched Clara Dawson. She was the first one awake, firing the kitchen stove before the sun breached the horizon. She was the last one to bed, cleaning the kitchen long after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse. She worked with a quiet, desperate resilience that intrigued him. He was looking for the gold digger, the manipulator, but he saw only a woman pushing herself to the point of exhaustion, earning her keep and then some. Their encounters were brief, dictated by the chores of the ranch. The first time they truly spoke was over a mule. Miller owned a mule named Judas, a creature of pure, spiteful intelligence. Grayson saw Clara trying to load 2 heavy sacks of flour onto the animal's back. She was trying to lead it from the stables to the root cellar. Judas would not move. Clara pulled, her face tight with frustration. The mule planted its feet, lowering its head. "Come on," she whispered, her voice shaking with effort. "Please." Grayson, mending a harness nearby, watched for a moment before stepping in. He did not approach her, but the mule. "He smells your hurry, ma'am," Grayson said, his voice quiet. She startled, her hand flying to her chest. She hadn't seen him. "I'm Silas Vance," he said, touching the brim of his battered hat. "Miss Dawson." She composed herself quickly, turning back to the mule. "He will not budge." "He won't, not if you pull straight on. You have to convince him it was his idea." Grayson stepped past her, taking the lead rope. He didn't pull. He simply stood beside the mule's head, rubbing its ear, speaking nonsense in a low monotone. After a full minute, he gave a gentle cluck of his tongue and walked, not pulling, just holding the rope. The mule hesitated, then followed him as if bewitched. Clara stared. "He's a contrary beast," Grayson said, tying the mule to the cellar post. He began to unload the heavy sacks, lifting them easily. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said. "Silas," he corrected. He set the last sack down. "Thank you, Silas." Her voice was soft, cultivated. It was the only thing about her that seemed to belong to the fine Boston family his sister had mentioned. "You should let one of the men handle Judas," he said. "He's known to bite." "I'm capable of doing my share," she said, a sudden frost in her tone. She looked at him, her gray eyes clear and cold, and he saw a flash of pride, sharp and fierce. Then it was gone. She nodded curtly and disappeared into the cellar. He respected the pride. He didn't understand the frost. Their next encounter came 2 days later, during a sudden, violent downpour. The Wyoming sky had a habit of turning from clear blue to bruising purple in a matter of minutes. Grayson was checking the horses in the far paddock when the sky opened. The rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, freezing sheets. Clara had been returning from the chicken coop, a basket of eggs in her arms. They both ran for the nearest shelter, the dark, cavernous smithy where Grayson had his bedroll. They tumbled inside, breathless, shaking water from their faces. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was a deafening roar. It was dark in the smithy, smelling of coal smoke and iron. They stood just feet apart, dripping onto the packed dirt floor. He could see the way her thin dress was plastered to her shoulders, the fine tremor in her hands as she tried to protect the basket of eggs. "Storms come fast here," he said, his voice loud over the din. She looked up, her face pale in the gloom. She nodded, pushing wet strands of dark hair from her eyes. She seemed smaller, younger, and utterly exhausted. "Everything does," she replied, her voice barely audible. She looked out at the rain, at the world being washed away in gray sheets. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the mountains, barely visible through the deluge. He saw her face set in that same wistful, trapped expression he had seen before. She was not just watching a storm. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to protect her. It was an instinct he hadn't felt in a decade. It was unwelcome, and it confused him. He was here to expose a liar, not to shelter a victim. "The rain will pass," he said, turning away, giving her his back. He offered her a dry grain sack he used for a pillow. "To dry your hair." She took it, and he heard her small, "Thank you." The guilt began then. It was a low, dull ache beneath his ribs. He was lying to her. Every minute he spent as Silas Vance, he was lying. He told himself it was necessary. He had to know the truth before he tied his name and his land to her. But watching her shiver in the cold smithy, her resilience looked less like a strategy and more like survival. His respect for her grew. She was not soft. She was not weak. She did not complain. She did the work set before her, and she did it well. But the mystery of her only deepened. She was a woman of contradictions. She was educated, yet she scrubbed floors. She was beautiful, yet she seemed to try to hide it. She was polite, yet she was as distant as the moon. The truth, or the first shadow of it, came to him late one night. He had been in the barn, checking on a mare that was close to foaling. It was past 10 o'clock. The ranch was still, the moon high and cold. He was walking back toward his lean-to when he heard voices from the wash house, a small outbuilding where the laundry was boiled. A single lamp burned inside. He heard the voice of Millie, the older woman who ran the ranch's laundry, a tough, pragmatic widow. "You cannot keep this up, child," Millie said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You're wearing yourself to a shade. You barely eat." Then he heard Clara's voice. It was not the quiet, polite tone she used with the Millers or the Hands. This voice was raw, thick with a pain that made Grayson stop in the shadows, his blood running cold. Millie, I have to earn my keep. I can't be a burden." "A burden? You're doing the work of 3. Miller knows it. This Mr. Holt you're meant to meet. They say he's the richest man in the territory. You'll be set. You won't have to scrub another floor." A sound came from Clara, a bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "Set, that's what they said in Boston. I was set before." "Hush now," Millie said. "That's Boston talk. That's guilt talk. Whatever happened back east, it's done. You're here now. This is Wyoming. It's a clean slate." Grayson leaned closer, straining to hear. He knew he should not be listening. He knew this was a violation. He could not move. "It's never done," Clara whispered, and the desperation in her voice was a knife in the quiet night. "You don't understand. It will follow me. They will follow me." "Who's they?" "I will never be free of the scandal. Millie, never." Scandal. The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. "Scandal is just a word rich folks use when they're bored," Millie said gruffly. "Out here, we care about what a person does, and I see you do good. Hard work." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of Clara drawing a shuddering breath. "But I'm not worthy," Clara whispered. The words were so quiet. Grayson almost missed them. "I'm not worthy of a second chance, and I am certainly not worthy of a good man." Grayson Holt stood frozen in the darkness, the cold wind whipping around him. He felt as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. This was not the calculation of a woman chasing a fortune. This was the confession of a fugitive. This was not ambition he had been hearing. It was fear. His entire deception, his clever plan to unmask her, suddenly felt cheap and cruel. He had come here expecting to find a predator. Instead, he had found a woman who believed she was not worthy of a second chance. He backed away from the wash house silently, his heart pounding a heavy, sick rhythm. He retreated to the darkness of his lean-to, the cold seeping into his bones, but he did not feel it. What scandal? What had she done, or what had been done to her, to fill her with such shame? What truth was she hiding that was so terrible she would flee across a continent and scrub floors to escape it? He lay on his rough bedroll, staring into the darkness. And, for the first time, Grayson Holt was afraid. He was not afraid of what she might do to him. He was afraid of the truth he had set out to find. Grayson did not sleep. He lay on his thin bedroll in the lean-to, the cold air creeping in, but his mind was on fire. The words he had overheard from the wash-house played over and over. A relentless loop of accusation and despair. Scandal. Never be free. Not worthy of a second chance. He had come to the Miller Ranch to unmask a fraud, an adventurous hunting his fortune. He had braced himself for cunning, for false smiles and calculated flattery. He had found, instead, a woman who scrubbed floors with a desperate fury, who flinched from a kind touch, and who whispered in the dark that she was not worthy of a good man. His deception, which had seemed a prudent, even clever, shield, now felt like a cudgel. He was a liar, spying on a woman who seemed to be buried under the weight of a terrible secret. When the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, he rose, his body stiff, his resolve shaken. He was no longer certain what he was looking for. He only knew he had to understand. He found Millie later that morning, her arms deep in a tub of steaming lye soap, her face set in a grim expression as she attacked a pile of stained canvas trousers. The air in the wash-house was thick and caustic. Grayson, acting the part of Silas, carried in 2 heavy buckets of water from the well. "Set them there, Silas," Millie said, not looking up. "More work than hands, always." Grayson poured the water into the rinse barrel. He kept his tone casual, the idle talk of a fellow worker. "Seems Miss Dawson works harder than any 2 hands here. She's a quiet one." Millie stopped scrubbing. She fixed him with a sharp, intelligent gaze. Her eyes were the color of faded denim, and they missed nothing. "She is, and a good worker, keeps to herself. Nothing wrong with that. Just seems refined, is all, for this kind of life." Grayson pressed, testing the water. "Boston's a long way from here. Must be some story." Millie straightened up, wiping her sudsy hands on her apron. "Mr. Vance," she said, and the use of his false surname was a clear warning. A person's past is their own property, and a woman's past, especially, is a heavy thing to carry. Out here, we don't ask folks to unpack their trunks unless they offer. She earns her bread. She's decent. That is the beginning and the end of the story, far as I'm concerned." The door was shut, firmly and quietly. Millie was loyal. He respected her for it, and it only deepened the pit of his guilt. He tried a different, more direct approach with Clara that evening. She was sweeping the porch, her movements rhythmic and tired. "Boston must feel like another world," he said, pausing at the steps. She stopped sweeping. He watched her hand tighten on the broom handle until her knuckles went white. She did not look at him. "I suppose it is. Different folks out here," he said, trying to sound encouraging. "No one much cares what you were, only what you are." Her shoulders tensed. "That's a kind thought, Silas." Her voice was polite, brittle as ice. "But I find folks are the same everywhere. They are always curious." She resumed sweeping. A clear and final dismissal. He had his answer. She was not just quiet, she was guarded. She was a fortress, and he was the enemy, laying siege with false colors. The dynamic between them shifted. Charged with his new, terrible knowledge, he found himself watching her, not for signs of deception, but for clues to her pain. He saw the way she startled when one of the hands laughed too loudly behind her. He saw the exhaustion she could not hide, a bone-deep weariness that made her movements seem heavy by the end of the day. A week later, a late frost settled on the valley, killing the new grass and stealing the warmth from the air. One of Miller's cows, having calved in the night, rejected the newborn. The hands found it in the morning, a small, slick, dun-colored heap, shivering violently, its cries thin and weak. "Won't make it," Miller said, shaking his head. "Too weak. Damned frost." Leave it. The coyotes will have it by nightfall. Grayson felt a pang of pragmatic agreement. It was the hard truth of the land. But that afternoon, he saw Clara slip out of the kitchen, carrying a bucket and a bundle of old blankets. He followed her to the barn. The calf was lying in the straw, barely moving. Grayson watched from the shadows of an empty stall as Clara knelt beside it. She did not coo or fuss. She was all business, her movements efficient. She rubbed the calf's small body with a rough blanket, her strokes firm, trying to bring the blood to the surface. She dipped her fingers into the bucket of warm, watered-down milk and patiently, stubbornly, forced them into the calf's mouth, trying to teach it to suckle. "Come on," she whispered, her voice low and fierce. "You will not die. I will not let you." The calf was too weak to respond. It shivered, its eyes dull. "You have to fight," she insisted, her voice breaking just a little. "Fight! Blast you!" Grayson stepped out of the shadows. "He's cold," she gasped, scrambling back, her eyes wide with fright, like a cornered animal. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, raising his hands. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was checking the tack." It was a clumsy lie. "He needs warmth. Rubbing won't be enough." She watched him, wary, but the desperation for the calf's life overrode her fear of him. "What do you suggest?" "We need to get the warm milk in him. Hold his head." He knelt beside her in the straw. The small space was filled with the scent of hay, cold earth, and the faint, sweet smell of the milk. He showed her how to hold the calf's jaw, how to tip its head back just so. He dipped a clean rag in the milk, wringing it out into the creature's mouth, drop by drop. It was painstakingly slow. They worked for nearly an hour, in almost complete silence. His hands were large and calloused next to hers. He saw that her own hands were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding from the lye soap and the cold. Yet her touch on the calf was impossibly gentle. He saw in that moment what his sister's letters had failed to capture, and what his own suspicions had blinded him to. This was not a sinner. This was a woman of profound, wounded strength. He saw her tenderness, not as a weakness, but as a stubborn act of defiance against a world that had, by her own admission, left her nothing. Finally, the calf gave a small shudder and swallowed. Its eyes seemed to focus. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding all evening. "There," Grayson said, his voice rough. "That's a start." He stood and fetched more blankets, fashioning a small, warm nest against the stall wall. He lifted the calf, which weighed almost nothing, and settled it. Clara was still kneeling, watching the calf. "Thank you," she said, not looking at him. "He'll need this every 2 hours, through the night," he said. "I'll do it," she said immediately. "You need sleep." "I'll do it," she repeated, her tone flat, leaving no room for argument. He nodded. "I'll fetch more warm milk before I turn in." He left her there, a dark-haired silhouette in the lantern light, guarding a life that the rest of the world had already dismissed as lost. That night, nursing the calf became their shared, unspoken secret. He would wake at midnight, and again at 3, and find her there in the barn, her heavy coat thrown over her nightdress, patiently feeding the small creature. He would take the bucket, refill it with warm milk from the kitchen stove, and bring it back to her. They rarely spoke more than a few words. "He's stronger," she might say. "He is," he would reply. This shared duty, this quiet conspiracy in the dark, began to dismantle the walls between them. The calf, which they silently named Scrapper, began to thrive, and as it gained strength, a fragile trust grew between the two humans who had saved it. Miller, seeing Silas was a capable hand, set him to repairing a long stretch of fencing on the northern pasture. The work was solitary, and it suited Grayson's dark mood. He was lost in a fog of confusion. His desire for this woman, his bride-to-be, was growing every day. It was a sharp, physical ache that caught him off guard, but it was tangled with the deep, abiding shame of his deception. He was falling in love with a woman he was actively lying to. He was setting a new post, tamping the earth down with heavy, angry strokes, when he heard her call his name.
Silas.
Clara was walking toward him from the ranch house, picking her way carefully over the uneven, frozen ground. She was carrying a canteen of water and a cloth-wrapped bundle.
Mrs. Miller sent some midday bread and bacon,"
she said as she approached.
"She was worried you'd work through."
"Thank you," he said, taking the offering. His fingers brushed hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth in the cold air. She pulled her hand back quickly.
The fence looks strong."
"It'll hold," he said. They stood in an awkward silence, the vast, empty prairie stretching out around them. She turned to go, but her boot caught on a tangle of old wire hidden in the dead grass. She cried out, stumbling forward, directly toward him. Grayson moved without thinking. He dropped the canteen and caught her, his hands finding her waist, pulling her flush against him to stop her fall. The world stopped. She was pressed against his chest, her hands flat on his shoulders, her face just inches from his. He could feel the sudden, rabbit-fast beat of her heart, or perhaps it was his own. He smelled the clean scent of wind and lye soap on her skin, and a fainter, warmer scent that was just her. Her eyes, gray and startled, were wide, her lips parted on a sharp, indrawn breath. It was a charged, breathless stillness. He could feel the slender strength of her, the softness of her body through their rough clothes. His hands burned where they held her. He wanted, with a sudden, devastating force, to lower his head and kiss her. He wanted to tell her his name, to confess everything, to wipe the fear from her eyes.
She
stammered, her voice a whisper. He realized he was holding her too tightly. He let her go, stepping back as if he'd been burned. "Are you all right? Did you twist your ankle?"
"No, I'm fine. I'm fine."
She was flustered, her face flushed a dark, painful red. She bent to retrieve the canteen, her movements jerky. I should get back to the kitchen." She fled, walking far too fast, almost running, back to the house. Grayson stood by the fence line for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ache of deception was now a living, breathing torment. He had caught her, and in that one moment, he had wanted her more than he had ever wanted anything. And she had looked at him. Silas, the broke farmhand, with something other than fear. It was confusion, yes, but it was not fear. After that, the air between them was different, thicker. They avoided being alone, yet they seemed to orbit each other. Their conversations by the dying embers of the cook stove fire grew longer. They talked about the land, the hard winters, the way the mountains looked at sunset. She had a dry, surprising wit that surfaced in rare, quick flashes, usually about the mule. Judas. He made her laugh once, a low, rusty sound, as if she had not used it in a very long time. The sound hit him square in the chest. He found himself wanting to tell her things, about his own ranch, about his sister, about the loneliness of the big house. He wanted to be Grayson Holt for her, the man who could offer her safety, who could protect her. But he was trapped in the lie he had built. How could he confess now? He was a spy. He had stolen her trust under a false name. The growing intimacy only made his guilt heavier. He was a hypocrite, warming his hands at a fire he had no right to share. The breaking point came on a moonless, star-bright night. The cold was so sharp it hurt to breathe. Grayson was in his lean-to, wrapped in every blanket he owned. When he heard it, a sound that cut through the silence of the ranch. A scream. It was choked off, turning into a desperate, sobbing cry. It came from the direction of the main house. He was out of his bedroll and had his boots on in seconds, his heart seizing with a primal fear. He ran, his feet silent on the frozen dirt, He expected to find an intruder, a threat. He found Clara. She was outside, standing near the woodpile, in nothing but her thin white nightgown. She was barefoot on the icy ground. She was not crying, but she was shaking so hard he could see it from 10 yards away. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her head bowed, her dark hair loose and wild around her face.
Clara,
he said, his voice low, trying not to startle her. She flinched violently, a small, wounded sound escaping her. She looked up, her eyes black with terror, but she did not seem to be seeing him. She was looking through him at something horrible. "You're freezing," he said, moving toward her slowly, as one might approach a spooked horse. He was wearing his heaviest coat, a thick sheepskin-lined canvas. He shrugged it off and, without asking permission, wrapped it around her, pulling the heavy collar up around her neck. Her skin was like ice. He put his hands on her shoulders to steady her. She was trembling like a leaf in a gale. "You had a nightmare," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, her teeth chattering. She buried her face in the rough wool collar of his coat, a coat that smelled of him, of leather and smoke and clean sweat. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough with a feeling he could not name. "You're safe. It was just a dream." She shook her head, a violent, negative motion. "No," she whispered, her voice muffled by the coat. "No, it's never just a dream." He held her there, his hands firm on her shoulders, offering his own warmth and solidity against the shaking terror that possessed her. He wanted to demand to know who had hurt her, what memory could do this to her. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes finally focusing on his face. She was searching for something, judgment, perhaps. She seemed to find only his raw concern, her face crumpled.
I didn't mean for him to die,
she whispered. The words, spoken so quietly, struck him with the force of a bullet. They were a raw, unguarded confession, torn from the deepest part of her. Him, the man from the scandal.
Clara,
he started, but he had no idea what to say.
I didn't,
she insisted, her voice breaking, a terrible, aching sob rising in her throat. I just wanted him to stop. I didn't mean for him to die. She was weeping now, deep, silent, agonizing shudders that racked her small frame. He pulled her closer, one hand moving to the back of her head, holding her as she cried into his shoulder. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He just held her, a liar comforting a woman who had just confessed to, at the very least, being present at a man's death. He stood in the freezing Wyoming night, holding his mail-order bride, and felt the last of his suspicions burn away, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. He got her back inside, handing her off to a sleepy, concerned Mrs. Miller, who clucked over her and led her away to the kitchen fire. Grayson went back to his lean-to, but not to sleep. He was consumed. He had to know. The secret was no longer a matter of his own financial safety. It was a matter of her survival. The next day, he moved with a grim purpose. He waited. He watched the rhythms of the ranch. His chance came mid-afternoon. Miller and the hands were miles away, branding runaways, misses. Miller and Millie had taken the wagon into town for supplies. He saw Clara walk out to the creek, laundry basket in hand. She would be gone for at least an hour. His heart pounded with a heavy, sick rhythm. He felt like the lowest kind of thief. He slipped inside the quiet house, his boots silent on the wooden floors. Her room was tiny, little more than a closet off the kitchen. It held a narrow cot, a washstand, and at the foot of the cot, a small, battered trunk. He stared at it. This was her whole life. Everything she had carried west. To open it was a violation he wasn't sure he could come back from. I didn't mean for him to die. He knelt and unfastened the simple leather straps. His hands were shaking. The trunk held very little. 2 faded calico dresses, a pair of worn boots, a small, cloth-wrapped Bible. Underneath the clothes, He felt a ridge, tucked beneath a loose flap of the trunk's lining. His fingers found a folded square of paper. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. It was from the Boston Traveler, dated 6 months prior. The headline was small, discreet. Banker falls to his death. Noted financier Harold Cunningham, 45, died last evening following a fall at his Beacon Hill residence. Sources report Mr. Cunningham fell down the main staircase during a private gathering. Authorities have called the death a tragic mystery. Mr. Cunningham was recently engaged to Miss Clara Dawson, 22, of the Boston Dawsons. Miss Dawson could not be reached for comment, and her current whereabouts are unknown. Grayson read it twice. His blood went cold. Fiancé, a man twice her age, a mysterious fall, and she had vanished. He saw it all, a terrible, clear picture. The scandal she had spoken of, the nightmare, the terror in her eyes. She had run. She was not just hiding from gossip. She was hiding from an accusation. He folded the clipping, his hands precise, and slipped it back into its hiding place, smoothing the lining. He closed the trunk, refastening the straps, leaving everything exactly as he had found it. He walked out of the house and stood in the blinding, indifferent sun. His entire world had tilted. Her past was darker than he could have imagined. But as he stood there, the newspaper's cold words echoing in his head, he did not feel betrayed. He felt a cold, clarifying rage. He saw her not as a killer, not as a malicious woman. He saw her as she was, a hunted animal, broken by something terrible, fleeing for her life. He saw the woman who saved a dying calf, who flinched from a loud noise, and who cried in her sleep. He walked back toward the barn, his steps heavy. He now knew her secret, or the shape of it, and it bound him to her, not just as a potential husband, but as the only person in the world who suspected the truth. He saw her coming back from the creek, her head bowed, leaning into the wind. She looked up and saw him waiting. He watched her hesitate. She was deciding whether to trust him. Silas, the farmhand. She gave him a small, tired nod and continued toward the house. He knew, in that moment, that he was in love with her, and he knew that his lie was the single greatest threat to her that remained. The knowledge of the newspaper clipping burned in Grayson's mind, a secret that poisoned his every interaction. He had come to expose a con artist. He had found a fugitive. The guilt of his own deception was a physical weight, a stone in his gut that made it hard to breathe. He was lying to a woman who was running for her life. He knew with a certainty that defied all his practiced cynicism that he had to confess. He could not continue this masquerade. He could not be Silas for one more day, not while she looked at him with that fragile, emerging trust, the trust he had cultivated under a false name. He was worse than the Denver banker's daughter. She had wanted his money. He was stealing this woman's soul. He spent the morning watching for an opportunity, his nerves stretched thin. He saw her in the barn, checking on Scrapper. The calf, now strong-legged and curious, nudged her hand, a living testament to the secret they had shared in the dark. The barn was quiet, the afternoon light streaming in golden bars through the slats. This was the place. This was the moment. He walked in, his boot heels dull on the packed earth. "He looks strong," Grayson said. Clara startled, then relaxed when she saw it was him. A small smile touched her lips, a rare, unguarded expression that struck him in the chest. He has a fearsome appetite. Thank you, Silas, for helping him." "We helped him," Grayson corrected. He stood a few feet from her. The air was warm, smelling of hay and animals. Safe. "Clara." She looked up, her smile fading, sensing the change in his tone. "There is something I have to tell you," he began, his voice rough. "Something I should have told you from the beginning. My name." He saw her brace, her eyes widening slightly, preparing for a blow. She was a woman accustomed to blows. He was about to say it. "My name is Grayson Holt."
Miller!
A voice boomed across the yard, sharp with authority.
Arthur Miller!
Clara flinched, her head whipping toward the sound. Grayson saw the color drain from her face, leaving it a stark, bloodless white. It was not just a reaction to a shout. It was terror.
Stay here,
Grayson commanded, his own confession forgotten, his instincts taking over. He moved to the barn door, peering out. A man on a tall bay horse sat in the center of the yard. He wore a dusty coat and a badge that glinted cold in the sunlight. A sheriff. Arthur Miller came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sheriff Brody, what brings you out this way?" "Afternoon. Arthur, just checking the territories," Brody said, his voice carrying clearly. He did not dismount. "I've got a query from back east. U.S. Marshal's office passed it down. Looking for a woman." Grayson turned back. Clara was gone. She had not run, she had evaporated. "Clara?" he whispered. He heard a sound, a frantic, mouse-like scratching from the back of the barn. He moved past the stalls, his heart hammering. She was in the last stall, the one deepest in shadow, pushing herself into the narrow gap between the wall and a towering stack of hay bales. She was shaking so violently he could hear her teeth chatter. "He's asking about a woman," Grayson said, his voice low and urgent. "Oh, God," she whispered, the sound a ragged exhalation. Her eyes were black pits of terror, fixed on the open barn door. "He found me! He found me!" "Outside," the sheriff continued. "Name of Clara Dawson. About 22, 23, dark hair, gray eyes, last seen in Boston. You heard of anyone like that passing through?" Grayson heard Miller hesitate. He heard Mrs. Miller make a small, confused sound in the kitchen doorway. "Clara," Grayson said, grabbing her arm. She was ice cold. "You have to tell me. What did you do?" "He said he'd see me hang," she sobbed, her voice cracking, her body rigid with fear. "Harold's brother, he's rich, he has judges. He said he would hunt me down." "The clipping," Grayson said, his mind racing. "The banker, Harold Cunningham." She stared at him, a new, wild terror in her eyes. Betrayal. "You know, how—" "I looked in your trunk. After your nightmare." He admitted, the shame of it burning him. "I'm sorry. There's no time. He is 10 yards away." "What happened? Clara, tell me the truth. He's asking for you by name." The terror of the sheriff outside was greater than her terror of him. The story tumbled out of her, broken, fragmented, the words tripping over one another. "He was my fiancé," she gasped, her eyes screwed shut. "He was older, powerful. Everyone said I was so lucky, but he drank. He was not a kind man. That night, he had been drinking for hours. He was in a rage. He accused me of looking at his cousin. He grabbed me. He tore my dress." She was reliving it, her voice dropping to a shredded whisper. "He was at the top of the stairs. He said he owned me, that he would teach me what happened to ungrateful women." He raised his hand. He was going to hit me. I was so scared. "What did you do?" Grayson demanded, his voice gentle but firm. "I pushed him," she cried, the words exploding from her. I pushed him away, to get his hands off me. I didn't mean to. He was drunk. He was unstable. He stumbled back. He just fell. He fell all the way down. The sound—" She choked, a dry, racking sob. "He didn't move, and his brother found me. I was standing there, my dress torn, and Harold was at the bottom. He screamed. He called me a murderer." She gripped the front of Grayson's shirt, her knuckles white. "I had no one. My parents are dead. I had no money. They would have believed the Cunninghams. They would have hanged me. I had to run. I saw the advertisement. Your sister's arrangement. It was a way to disappear. A new name. A new life. I just wanted to be safe. Grayson's blood ran cold, then hot. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed through him. Rage at the dead man, Harold. Rage at the brother who was hunting her. Rage at a system that would crush this woman and not even ask why her dress was torn. And beneath it, a profound, agonizing shame. He, too, was a liar. He, too, had trapped her in a deception.
Silas, you in there?
Miller called. His voice strained. Sheriff wants to know if we've seen anyone. Grayson made a decision. It was simple. It was final. He covered Clara's hand with his own. "Stay here," he whispered. "Do not make a sound. Do not move. I will handle this." He let go of her and walked out of the barn, blinking in the bright sunlight, forcing his body to relax, to resume the posture of a simple, tired farmhand. Sheriff Brody fixed him with a hard stare. Miller and his wife were on the porch, their faces pale and confused. "This is Silas Vance. Works for me," Miller said, his voice unsteady. "You seen a woman like I described, Vance?" Brody asked. Grayson shook his head slowly. He did not look at the Millers. He looked directly at the sheriff. "I have, Sheriff, but she ain't here." "What do you mean?" Brody said, leaning forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "She left," Grayson said, his voice flat and believable. "Day before yesterday. Maybe 2 days. Packed her little trunk and paid old Jedediah, the freighter, for a ride to Cheyenne. Said she was heading south."
But Silas, Mrs.
Miller began, her voice high with confusion. "She's in the—" Grayson turned his head and looked at her. It was not the look of Silas, the laborer. It was the look of Grayson Holt, the man who owned half the territory. It was a look of absolute, cold command. It stopped her words in her throat. She saw the warning. She saw the danger. She fell silent, her hand flying to her mouth. Miller, who had seen that look in other men of power, stepped back, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. Brody looked between them, suspicious.
She leave in a hurry? Why?
"Seemed so," Grayson said, shrugging. "She was a city woman, sheriff. Not used to the cold, not used to the work. Said Wyoming was too rough for her. Said she wanted to find work in a place like Denver, a real city." He made it plausible. He gave the sheriff a reason he could write down in a report. A woman who was soft and ran from the hard life. It was a common enough story. Brody spat into the dust. He looked at the barn, then at the house, then back at Grayson. He was not entirely convinced, but he had no warrant and no reason to disbelieve a simple farmhand.
"And you?"
Brody said, pointing a finger at Miller.
"You'd tell me if you were harboring a fugitive."
Of course. Sheriff," Miller stammered, casting a terrified glance at Grayson. Miller was a good man, caught in something he did not understand, but he followed the strongest horse, right now. That was Silas. "The man is right. She left, took us all by surprise." "Right," Brody said, unconvinced. He pulled on his reins, turning the bay. "Well, if you see her, you send word to my office. Someone back east ain't finished looking for her yet, and they're paying good money for word." He kicked his horse, and the three of them, Grayson, Miller, and his wife, stood frozen, watching him ride away until he was nothing but a speck of dust on the horizon. The moment the sound of the horse faded, Grayson turned and walked back into the barn. The silence in the yard was absolute, broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. When Grayson re-entered the barn, the air was thick, choked with dust and terror. Clara was in the same spot, pressed against the wall, her body rigid. She looked like a ghost, her eyes fixed on the doorway. "He's gone," Grayson said. She did not move. She did not seem to be breathing.
"Clara, he's gone. You're safe."
He crossed the stall and put his hands on her shoulders. She was still trembling, caught in the grip of the terror. He gave her a gentle shake. "Clara." She let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed against him, her legs giving way. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her up. She was not crying. She was just empty. "You lied," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "Yes. For me, you lied to the sheriff. You made Mr. Miller lie." "Yes." She pulled back, her hands gripping his arms, and looked up at him. Her face was a ruin of fear and confusion. She was searching his eyes, looking for the trick, the angle, the price. She found none. "Why?" she asked, her voice raw. "You don't know me. You could be in terrible trouble." "I know you," he said, his voice rough. "I've seen you with the calf. I've heard you in your sleep, and I heard what you just told me." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes. "And I believe you." Those 4 words, "I believe you." It was the key. It was the match to the tinder. It was everything no one had ever said to her. She surged upward, her hands sliding from his arms to his neck, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of pure, desperate survival. It was the kiss of a drowning woman finding her first breath of air. It was a raw, aching collision, fueled by the adrenaline of the last hour, by the terror of the law, by the shame of her confession, and by the stunning, shocking relief of his protection. Grayson groaned, his own control shattering. All the desire he had suppressed, all the guilt, all the protective rage, it all erupted. His arms clamped around her like steel bands, lifting her off her feet, pressing her back against the rough wood of the stall. He kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own. It was a claiming. He was branding her as his, safe from the sheriff, safe from Harold's ghost, safe from all of it. The world shrank to the smell of hay and sweat and the rough canvas of his coat. She clawed at his shirt, needing to be closer, needing to feel the solid, living warmth of the man who had stood between her and the gallows. He tore his mouth from hers, his breath ragged, and buried his face in her neck. "You're safe," he rasped, his voice thick. "I won't let anyone take you." It was a vow. It was the truest thing he had ever said, even as he lived his deepest lie. He half carried, half dragged her to the clean pile of hay they kept for Scrapper, the blankets they had shared, now a bed. He laid her down, his body covering hers, a shield against the world. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a wild, burning need, a need to be seen, to be held, to be alive. He was Silas, the farmhand, a man with nothing but the strength in his hands. And she was Clara, the fugitive, a woman with nothing but a secret. In the dusty shadows of the barn, they gave in to the fire that had been burning between them from the beginning. It was raw, desperate, and silent. A collision of 2 people who had been utterly alone and were, for this one night, finally, not. It was a fight for life, a desperate affirmation against the judgment of the world, and it left them spent, tangled, and clinging to each other as the last light of day faded from the world. Grayson woke before dawn. The first light was a cold, gray knife edge in the barn. Clara was still asleep, her face pressed into his shoulder, her dark hair spread across his coat, which he had wrapped around her. Her face, in sleep, was free of fear. She looked young and peaceful and heartbreakingly vulnerable. The guilt of the morning was a different creature from the passion of the night. It was cold, heavy, and absolute. He was a liar. He had taken advantage of her terror, her gratitude. He had let her find solace in Silas, a man who did not exist. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They focused on his, and for a long, quiet moment, there was no fear, no shame, just a deep, shuddering connection. He opened his mouth, the confession rising in his throat. "Clara, I am not—" Before he could speak, She leaned up on one elbow. She looked at his face, at the dark stubble on his jaw, at the man who had lied for her. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not the desperate kiss of the night before. This was slow, soft. It was a kiss of profound, staggering tenderness. It was a kiss of ownership. She pulled back, her lips brushing his as she spoke, her voice a low murmur. "I want to feel worthy again." Her words were a blade in his chest. "I think," she whispered, her eyes clear and steady on his. "With you, I could—" He stared at her, his heart breaking. She had found her worthiness, her second chance, in the arms of a broke laborer, a fiction he had created. If he told her the truth now, "I am Grayson Holt, the man you were shipped here to marry, the rich rancher, just like Harold. I have been spying on you from the day I arrived." It would not just break her trust, it would destroy her. She would see him as the ultimate predator, a man who had lied, spied, and then finally taken her, all under a false flag. The fragile worthiness she felt would shatter into 1,000 pieces. She would see him as the worst kind of trap. He could not be the man who did that to her. Grayson Holt, the master of his own universe, was a captive of his own lie. He swallowed the confession. It tasted like ash. He lifted a hand, his fingers shaking almost imperceptibly, and brushed the hair from her face. He kissed her forehead, a gesture of profound, agonizing guilt. He held her close, the lie a living, breathing thing between them, and said nothing. The morning after was a betrayal. The world, which had been reduced to the warm, safe space of the barn, had rushed back in, cold and sharp. Clara felt a fragile, aching tenderness, a feeling so new it terrified her. She had woken in her own small bed, Silas having walked her back to the house in the pre-dawn gray. A silent, protective shadow, but the memory of his touch, the impossible, solid reality of his protection, had given her something she thought was lost forever, a flicker of worth. She felt a desperate need to give something back, a small gesture to anchor the reality of the night. She saved a piece of her own breakfast bread and, when Mrs. Miller was occupied, slipped out to the lean-to by the smithy. It was a cold, mean little space, a thin bedroll on a canvas cot, a single saddlebag, a pair of boots. This was the sum of his worldly possessions. Her heart ached for him, for his poverty, a poverty that made his defense of her all the more noble. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by lying to a sheriff. She knelt by the cot to leave the bread, intending to straighten the rough blanket. Her hand brushed against something crisp, hidden beneath the thin mattress. Paper. Curious, she drew it out. It was a letter, folded thick, on expensive, creamy stock. It was not the sort of paper a broke farmhand would have. The postmark was from Philadelphia. She unfolded it. It was not his. It was addressed, in a fine, sloped hand, to Mr. Grayson Holt. The name struck her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Grayson Holt, the rancher, the wealthy, faceless man his sister had arranged for her, the man she was supposed to marry, the owner of the vast, neighboring property. She stood up, her entire body numb, the letter shaking in her hand. She read the first lines. "My dearest Grayson, she has arrived, a month early. Miss Clara Dawson is currently in Wyoming." The lean-to began to spin. It was all there. His sister, her name, the Miller Ranch. Silas. Silas was not Silas. Silas, who had held her. Silas, who had kissed her. Silas, who had... He was Grayson Holt. The tenderness of the morning curdled into a black, burning acid. The entire thing, every shared look, every kind word, the mule, the calf, the storm in the smithy, the nightmare, the sheriff. It was all a lie, a test, a cruel, elaborate piece of theater, staged by this man to evaluate her. He had watched her scrubbing floors. He had watched her beg a mule. He had listened to her nightmares. He had heard her confession, not as a friend, but as a judge. He had weighed her and found her. What? The humiliation was so profound it choked her. And then came the rage, a white-hot fury that burned away the numbness, the fear, the shame. He had not just lied. He had taken her terror and her gratitude and used them against her. He had let her give herself, her last, broken piece of trust, to a ghost. She ran from the lean-to, the letter clutched in her fist, her bare feet pounding the frozen dirt. She did not care who saw. She saw him by the northern fence line, tamping a post, his shoulders working, the very picture of honest labor. The sight of him, still wearing the costume of Silas Vance, made her want to scream. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice a raw tear in the quiet morning. Grayson spun around, the tamping bar dropping from his hands. He saw her face, contorted with a fury he had never seen, and he saw the letter in her hand. He knew, in that instant, the lie was over. "Clara," he said, taking a step toward her. "Do not," she hissed. "Say my name." She marched up to him, close enough to see the panic in his eyes, and shoved the letter against his chest. "This was under your mattress, in the shack you pretend to live in. Clara, let me explain." "Explain what?" she cried, her voice breaking with the force of her rage. "Explain that you are Grayson Holt, the man I was supposed to marry? The rich rancher who was too cowardly to meet me face to face? Did you enjoy the show? Mr. Holt, did you enjoy watching me scrub pots? Did you find it amusing when I cried in my sleep? Was I performing to your standards?" "It was not like that," he said, his voice desperate. He was no longer Silas. The slouch was gone. He stood tall, his face a mask of anguish. "What was it like?" she demanded. "You have been spying on me since the day I arrived. You judged me. You listened to my secrets. You let me. She could not say it. The shame burned her throat. "You let me believe you were poor. You let me believe you were my friend. You let me believe you were safe. You are a liar. A cruel, calculating liar." "I am," he shouted back, his own anguish breaking free. I was afraid. Clara, I was terrified." "Afraid of me?" She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "A woman with nothing but a single trunk and a secret that could hang her. You were afraid of me." "I was afraid of a woman hunting my name, my land," he confessed, the truth pouring out of him. "The last woman who stood in my house tried to rob me blind. My sister sent me your impeccable references. A quiet lamb from Boston. It felt false. I had to know. I had to see who you were when you thought no one of consequence was watching." His confession only damned him further. "So you built this test, and when did you decide I had passed? When I saved the calf? Or was it when I confessed to a man's death? Or was it last night, in the barn? Was that the final proof you needed? That I was so broken and grateful I would fall into the arms of a farmhand?" "No!" he roared, grasping her arms. "That is not... I fell in love with you, not the bride. You, the woman who fought for that calf, the woman who stood in the rain and looked at the mountains like she was trapped. I saw your strength. I saw your kindness. And when I found that clipping, when you told me what happened, I wasn't judging you. I was undone." "You fell in love with me," she repeated, her voice dead, all the fire gone, leaving only cold ash. "You fell in love with me, but you did not trust me. You did not trust me enough to tell me your name. You lied to the sheriff, yes, but then you kept lying to me. Last night was a lie. You let me give myself to Silas Vance, and Silas Vance does not exist." "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice breaking. "You looked at me this morning and said you wanted to feel worthy. How could I tell you that the man you trusted was the rich rancher who had been spying on you all along? How could I be the one to destroy that? I wanted to love you for who you were, not as a groom evaluating a bride. I did it all wrong." She stared at him. At this stranger. He was right. He had destroyed it. He was no different from Harold Cunningham. Harold, who had tried to own her with his fists and his money. Grayson Holt had tried to own her with his deception and his false kindness. Both men had seen her as a thing to be tested, to be acquired. She pulled her arms from his grasp. "I would rather face the consequences of Boston," she said, her voice shaking but clear as glass, "than be owned by a man who builds a trap and calls it love." She turned and walked away.
Clara!
He called after her, his voice raw with panic.
Clara, wait!
She did not look back. She walked to the house, packed her small trunk, her hands shaking so hard she could barely fasten the straps. "Mrs." Miller tried to stop her, her face a mess of confusion. Clara just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and walked out the door. She walked past the barn, past the fences. She walked out onto the open prairie. With no destination, no plan, just a burning, agonizing need to escape the man who had seen all of her and betrayed all of her. She walked for miles, until the Miller ranch was just a speck, and her anger collapsed into a deep, hollow despair. She finally sat by the side of a half-frozen creek, her trunk in the dust beside her, and wept. She had run from Boston to save her life. She had run from Grayson Holt to save her soul. And now she was in the middle of nowhere, with nothing and no one. She heard the plodding steps of a mule and looked up. Millie was riding toward her, her face set in its usual grim, pragmatic lines. She dismounted, not with sympathy, but with impatience. "So," Millie said, crossing her arms, "you're running again. That worked out so well for you last time." "You don't understand," Clara sobbed, wiping her face. "He lied. All of it. He's Grayson Holt. He was spying on me." "I know," Millie said. "I saw his face when Brody was here. I saw his face this morning. The man's a fool. A rich, scared fool." "He used me. He pretended." "He pretended," Millie interrupted. "And then he stopped pretending. Did he lie when he stood between you and that sheriff? Did he lie when he helped you save that damn calf? Did he look like he was lying to you in that barn last night?" "It was all part of it," Clara insisted. "A trick." Millie shook her head, her gaze softening just a fraction. "Love ain't clean. Child, it ain't a storybook. It's a messy, stupid, painful business. And folks do stupid, cowardly things when they're scared of it. And that man," she jerked her head back toward the ranch, "is terrified. He was scared of being tricked, and now he's scared of losing the one real thing he's ever found. He broke my trust." "He did," Millie agreed. "So what? You gonna sit here and let your pride freeze you to death? You can run. You can keep running for the rest of your life, proving how proud and how alone you are. Or you can turn around, march back there, and fight for the one man who looked a United States sheriff in the eye and chose to lie for you. Love doesn't survive on its own. Child, it doesn't survive if you run from it. It survives because you fight for it." Millie turned, grabbed the mule's reins. "I ain't gonna tell you what to do, but vanishing is a coward's game, and I don't take you for a coward." Millie left her there, alone with the wind and the hard, cold truth of her words. Grayson returned to the ranch, frantic. Clara was gone. Miller and his wife met him, their faces pale. "She left Mr. Holt," Miller said, the name sounding foreign. "Just walked out." Grayson was saddling his stallion, the powerful black horse he had ridden in on, when a new rider entered the yard. This man was not the sheriff. He was tall, thin, and wore a black duster despite the cold. He had 2 pistols strapped to his hips, tied down low. His eyes were the color of ice, and they missed nothing. He dismounted, his movements economical and predatory. "Arthur Miller," the man said, his voice soft but carrying. "I am. Name's Locke. I'm a private agent, hired by Mr. Josiah Cunningham of Boston. He produced a paper from his coat. Got a federal warrant here for the arrest of one Clara Dawson. Murder. I've been tracking her for a month. I know she was here. Sheriff Brody's report was unconvincing. Grayson froze, his hand on the saddle. This was not a man who could be fooled or turned away. This was a hunter. Locke's icy gaze slid to Grayson. "And who are you? You ain't one of Miller's hands." "My name is Grayson Holt," Grayson said, his voice hard. Locke smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "The groom? Well, looks like your bride ran out on you and the law. Mr. Cunningham is offering a reward, $200, for any information leading to her capture." Grayson's blood ran cold. Clara was out there, alone, with this man, this vulture, on her trail. He had to find her first. He had to... Where would she go? He thought back, desperately, to their quiet conversations, the talks by the fire. She had mentioned it once, a wistful, passing comment. A walk she had taken, deep into the foothills. She had found a place, an old, abandoned hunting cabin by a stream. It was the only place. She had whispered, "that I have felt truly quiet since I left home." He swung into the saddle. "Where are you going? Holt?" Locke asked, his hand drifting near his pistol. "I know where she'd go," Grayson said, his voice a low growl. He was done with lies. He was done with fear. He looked Locke dead in the eye. "She's my future wife, and you will not touch her." He kicked the stallion, leaping from the yard, not toward town, but toward the foothills. He rode hard, the wind whipping his face, his only thought to find her. He had to find her before Locke did. He rode for hours, the light beginning to fail, the air turning bitingly cold. He pushed the stallion up a rocky, overgrown game trail, his heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with himself. He finally saw it, tucked into a fold in the hills, almost invisible, a small, dilapidated cabin. A thin, pale wisp of smoke was rising from the stone chimney. He burst through the door, his pistol in his hand, his heart in his throat. Clara was there, huddled by a tiny, struggling fire, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. She scrambled to her feet, a piece of firewood raised as a club, a scream tearing from her throat. "Get away from me! Clara, it's me! Listen to me!" He grabbed her, shaking her. "There's a man, a bounty hunter. His name is Locke. He's at the ranch. He was hired by Cunningham's brother. He has a warrant. He's not like Brody. Clara, he's a hunter. He's coming for you." She stopped fighting, the terror in his voice finally cutting through her own anger. She saw the truth in his eyes. This was not a lie. This was real. "He's coming here?" she whispered, her entire body beginning to shake. "He will," Grayson said. He released her, moving to the door, slamming the heavy wooden bar across it. He checked the single, cracked window. "He's smart. He'll track me." He turned back to her. She was standing in the middle of the tiny, one-room cabin, looking utterly lost. He crossed to her, his heart breaking, and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a second, then collapsed, her fists clutching his coat. The terror of the bounty hunter had shattered the last of her pride. "I will not let him take you," Grayson vowed, his voice a low, fierce growl in her ear. "I don't care about Boston. I don't care what you did or did not do. I will not let you go." He held her as the last light died, leaving the cabin in the dim, flickering glow of the fire. They stood in the center of the cold room, wrapped in each other's arms, the hunter outside, and their own broken trust inside. The night was long and cold. They huddled together under his coat, sharing the few blankets she had found. The fear was a living thing in the room, but it was shared. He held her while she wept, quiet, exhausted tears for the mess her life had become, for the man who had fallen, for the life she had lost. He held her and confessed his own deep, agonizing shame, his cowardice, his pride, his arrogance. He confessed that he had been so afraid of being a fool that he had become a monster. In the darkness of the cabin, with a killer on their trail, the last of the lies burned away. There was only the grief, the shame, and the cold, hard reality of the love that had grown in spite of it all. "I will not leave you again," he whispered into her hair, as she shivered in his arms. "Whatever happens when the sun comes up, I will not leave you." And this time she believed him. Dawn broke cold and sharp, finding them not asleep, but waiting. The tiny fire had died, leaving the cabin an icebox. They sat huddled under the blankets, the shared fear a tangible thing in the air. Grayson held her, his body a rigid shield, his ears tuned to the gray wilderness outside. He had barred the door, wedged a log against the weak window frame. He was no longer Silas, the shiftless laborer, nor was he the arrogant landowner. He was just a man, guarding the only thing he had ever truly valued. The sound came just after sunrise, the metallic click of a horse's shod hoof on stone. Not a fast approach, a slow, methodical, predatory stalk. Grayson's hand, the one not holding Clara, rested on the grip of his pistol. He rose silently, moving to the side of the door. Clara scrambled to the darkest corner, her hand clutching the rusted iron poker from the fireplace. "And Mr. Holt," a voice called, deceptively pleasant. "I know you're in there, and I know the lady is with you. I just want to talk. I've got the paperwork. It's all official." Grayson remained silent. He would not give the man a target. "Don't make this difficult," Locke's voice continued. Closer now. He was on foot, likely just outside the door. "I'm a federal agent. Son, you're interfering with justice. That's a federal crime." "You are not a federal agent," Grayson said, his voice low and hard, projecting through the wood. "You're a hired dog." A dry chuckle. "Call it what you like. I have a warrant, signed by a judge, for the arrest of Clara Dawson, fugitive from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Murder, Mr. Cunningham is very insistent. Now, open the door." "Slide the warrant under the door," Grayson commanded. "If it's real, we'll talk." There was a pause. Locke was considering it. "Fine. You're a careful man. I respect that." A sheet of thick paper slid into the gap beneath the door, into the sliver of morning light. Grayson, never moving from his protected position, stooped and snatched it. He unfolded it. It looked official. Heavy embossing. A signature. The charge. Murder. But Grayson looked closer. The signature was just a scrawl. The embossed seal was from a bank in Cheyenne, not a federal court. It was good. It was good enough to fool a local sheriff. But it was not real. "It's a forgery, Locke," Grayson said, his voice cold with contempt. "A very expensive forgery, but the signature is sloppy." The silence outside was absolute. The pretense was over. The door crashed inward. The bar splintered, the rotten wood of the frame giving way to a single, powerful kick. Locke stood there, framed in the doorway, the icy morning light behind him, his black duster sweeping back. His pistol was in his hand. Level. The paper was a courtesy. Locke sneered. "Now the lady. Step aside. Holt." Grayson didn't move. He stood directly between Locke and the corner where Clara was frozen, her knuckles white on the poker. "She is not going anywhere," Grayson said. "Do you want to die for her? A woman who ran from a murder charge? She's not worth it. Holt, your ranch is, your life is, give her to me. I'll even forget your interference." "No." Locke's eyes hardened. "I'm tired of this. I get paid when I deliver her, dead or alive. It makes no difference to me." He raised the pistol, aiming not at Grayson, but at Clara. Grayson moved. He did not go for his own gun. He dove forward, low and fast, tackling Locke at the knees. The pistol fired. the shot exploding in the tiny cabin, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling, showering them with splinters and dirt. The two men crashed through the doorway, rolling in the frozen mud and pine needles. It was not a fight of skill. It was a brutal, desperate brawl. Locke was wiry and strong, his movements like a snake's. Grayson had weight and pure, protective rage. Grayson slammed his fist into Locke's jaw, but Locke twisted, his hand driving a knee into Grayson's ribs. They scrambled to their feet, gasping in the thin, cold air.
You damned fool!
Locke spat, blood trickling from his lip. He lunged, but not with his fists. A knife appeared in his hand, a long, thin blade that glittered in the sun. Grayson barely dodged the first thrust, the knife slicing through the fabric of his thick coat.
Gray!
Clara screamed from the doorway. Locke used the distraction, lunging again. Grayson grabbed the bounty hunter's wrist. The two men locked in a deadly stalemate, their faces inches apart.
She'll watch you die,
Locke hissed, pushing the blade closer and closer to Grayson's chest. Grayson's feet slipped on the icy ground. He felt the cold steel prick his skin. He roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and twisted, using Locke's own momentum to spin him around. He slammed Locke's back against the trunk of a massive pine. The bounty hunter's head hit the wood with a sickening, solid crack. Locke's eyes glazed, but his grip on the knife did not loosen. He slumped, and as he did, he dragged the blade down. A reflexive, spiteful movement. Grayson cried out, a sharp, choked sound. He felt a searing, white-hot pain rip across his left side, just under his ribs. Locke slid to the ground, his eyes unfocused. The knife was still in his hand. Grayson stumbled back, his hand flying to his side. It came away dark, thick with blood. The world tilted, the trees spinning. Locke shook his head, clearing it, and looked down at his own hand. He saw the blood. He looked up at Grayson, who was leaning against a tree, gasping. A slow, cruel smile spread across Locke's face.
You're done,
Locke whispered, raising his pistol from the ground where it had fallen. He cut you deep. Holt, even if I leave, you'll bleed out in an hour. He leveled the pistol. Now, the girl, then you. No, Grayson panted. Locke cocked the hammer. Go to hell, Grayson said. He pushed off the tree, ignoring the fire in his side, and launched himself forward. Not at Locke, but at the hand holding the gun. He hit it just as Locke fired. The bullet went wild, screaming into the woods. The force of Grayson's tackle sent them both to the ground. Locke's knife was still in his other hand. He raised it, aiming for Grayson's throat. Grayson saw it coming. He grabbed Locke's wrist with both hands. His own blood, slick and hot, covering their arms. He had no choice. He was dying. Clara was next. With the last of his strength, he forced the knife hand down, and in turning the blade, he put all his weight behind it. Locke's eyes went wide, a terrible, wet sound. The man's body went rigid, then limp. The pistol fell from his other hand. Grayson rolled off him, his body on fire. He lay on his back on the frozen ground, staring up at the clear, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky. The world was going gray at the edges. Grayson. Clara was beside him, her face a mask of terror. She had seen it. She had seen all of it. He's, she stammered, looking at Locke's still body. Dead, Grayson whispered. His side was a universe of pain. He's dead. You're bleeding, she cried, her hands fluttering over the wound, afraid to touch it. Oh, God, Grayson, you're bleeding so much. He cut me, Grayson managed, his teeth gritted, deep. The terror on Clara's face vanished, replaced by a sudden, cold clarity. The woman who had been a fugitive, a victim, was gone. The woman who had saved the calf, who had survived Boston, took over. We have to stop it, she said, her voice firm. She ripped at the hem of her own dress, tearing a long, thick strip of wool. Press this. Press it hard. She helped him sit up, her small body taking his weight. He cried out as the movement pulled at the wound. I know, she said, her voice tight. I know, but we have to get you on the horse. We cannot stay here. We have to get to your ranch. Now. The body, Grayson panted. He tried to kill you, she said, her voice like flint. You defended yourself. I saw it. I am a witness. Now, live, Grayson, live. The journey back to his ranch was a red-gray blur of agony. It took hours. Clara had to get him onto his stallion, his body slumping, half-conscious, over the horse's neck. She took Locke's horse, a tough-looking roan, tying its reins to Grayson's saddle, and led them down the treacherous path, her gaze constantly flicking back to him. He blacked out twice, but each time he woke to her voice, sharp and urgent, calling his name, forcing him to hold on. When they finally rode into the yard of his main house, the foreman, a weathered man named Jacob, ran out, his face pale with shock. Mr. Holt, my God, what happened? Get him inside, Clara commanded, sliding from her horse, her face streaked with dirt and his blood. Now, get me boiled water, clean bandages, whiskey, and a needle and thread, and send 2 men you trust back to a hunting cabin in the foothills. There is a dead man there. His name is Locke. Bring him back, and send word to the sheriff in Cheyenne. Not Brody, the real sheriff. Tell him there was a fight, and Mr. Holt is wounded. Jacob stared, frozen for a second by the authority in this strange, blood-stained woman's voice. Now, she shouted. Jacob moved. They carried him into his own bedroom, a vast room he had always found empty, and laid him on the bed. Clara cut away his bloody shirt with a hunting knife from his own saddlebag. The wound was long and deep, an ugly, weeping gash along his ribs. It was no longer bleeding heavily, but it was bad. This will hurt, she said, her voice gentle for the first time. He was conscious, barely, his skin gray and clammy. I know, he whispered. She poured the raw whiskey directly into the wound. Grayson arched off the bed with a guttural scream, his body rigid, before falling back, unconscious. Good, she whispered, her own hands shaking. That's better. For 2 days, she did not leave his side. She stitched the wound herself, her hands clumsy but determined, her stitches small and tight. She cleaned it, she bandaged it. He fell into a deep fever, a raging infection from the dirty blade. He thrashed in the bed, calling out, not for her, but for Silas, for his father, for his sister. Clara sat in the darkness, bathing his face with cool water, forcing broth and laudanum between his cracked lips, holding him down when he tried to rise. Jacob and the housekeeper watched her with a mixture of awe and fear. This mail-order bride, this fugitive, had taken command of the ranch. She moved with a purpose they had never seen. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Grayson woke, his mind clear for the first time. The pain was a dull, heavy throb, but the fire was gone. He was weak, weaker than a newborn. He saw her, asleep in the chair by his bed, her head slumped on her chest, her face gaunt with exhaustion. She was still wearing the dress she had torn, stained with his blood and the dirt of the cabin. He lifted a shaky hand and touched her arm. Clara. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and clear. A wave of profound relief washed over her face. You're back, she whispered. You stayed, he said, his voice a dry rasp. I stayed. She poured him a glass of water, her hand supporting his head as he drank. The simple act was more intimate than any kiss. He lay back, exhausted by the effort. He looked at her, really looked at her. The hunted look was gone. She was tired, she was worn, but she was whole. You saved my life, he said. "We saved each other's," she replied. She sat on the edge of the bed, taking his hand. "The sheriff from Cheyenne came. Jacob told him what I said. They found Locke's forged warrant in his pocket. They found the real one, too. He was a known killer, wanted in 2 territories. The sheriff ruled it. Self-defense. It's over. That part, at least." They sat in silence. The threat of Locke was gone, but the threat of Boston remained.
Clara,
He said, his grip on her hand as strong as he could make it. She looked at him, and her eyes were not the eyes of the woman he had met at Miller's. They were not the eyes of the woman he had held in the barn. They were the eyes of his equal. "I don't want to run anymore, Grayson," she said, her voice low and steady. When I saw him raise that gun, I wasn't scared. I was angry. Angry that he was trying to steal what was mine. Angry that he was trying to steal you." She leaned closer, her voice fierce. "I am done being a ghost. I am done being a victim. Harold's brother can send 12 more men. I will not run. I want to live. Here, with you." She paused, and her gaze softened. "But I will not be your arrangement. I will not be the mail-order bride you were forced to accept. And I will not be the fugitive you're obligated to protect. I choose you, Grayson Holt, freely, if you still want me." He had no words. He could only lift her hand to his lips, his own eyes burning. The next week, as he regained his strength, he began to fight. He could not ride, but he could write. He used the power he had held in reserve. He sent a telegram, pages long, to Elias Thorne, his lawyer in Cheyenne. He sent another to Judge Abram Powell, a retired federal judge in Denver, a man who owed him a significant favor. He explained everything: the coerced engagement to Harold Cunningham, the violence, the fall, the threat from the brother. Josiah. The judge sent a telegram back. "Josiah Cunningham is a brute, but he has money and influence. Gossip is not evidence. A sheriff's report from here holds no water in Boston. You need a witness. You need to break their narrative." Grayson called Clara to his bedside. The night he died. Clara? Who else was there? She stared at the floor, her mind going back. The staff. They were all terrified of him. They were in the kitchen. But Sarah, the maid, a young Irish girl, she was in the hall. She saw him. She saw him tear my dress. She saw him raise his hand. But she vanished after, I think the Cunninghams paid her to disappear. "Sarah," Grayson said. "Do you remember her last name?" "O'Malley," Clara whispered. "Sarah O'Malley." It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of telegrams, of private investigators hired by Thorne, of money moving across the wire. Grayson's men, armed with the law and his money, were a different kind of hunter than Locke. They found her. She was working in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, under a different name. At first, she was terrified, refusing to speak, but Judge Powell's agent offered her protection. He offered her a new life, far from Boston, a homestead claim in Colorado, paid for by Grayson. All she had to do was write down the truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a month after the fight, carried by the same express rider who had brought Grayson's sister's first note. Grayson was sitting in his study, Clara beside him. His side was healing, a thick purple scar, a permanent reminder. He let Clara open it. It was a sworn, written statement, notarized by a magistrate. Clara read it aloud, her voice shaking. "I, Sarah O'Malley, being of sound mind, do swear the following. On the night of August 10th, I was in the employ of Mr. Harold Cunningham. He was a violent man, especially in drink. He and Miss Dawson argued. He forbade her to leave the house. I saw him grab her by the arm in the upper hall. She told him he was hurting her. She said she was leaving him. She pulled away, and he tore the shoulder of her dress. He shouted that he would ruin her. He raised his hand to strike her. She lifted her hands to defend herself, pushing his chest. He was drunk, sir. He was unbalanced. He stumbled backward. His heel caught, and he fell. She did not push him down the stairs. She only protected herself. He fell because of the drink and his own rage. I fled, because Mr. Josiah Cunningham, his brother, told me I would be arrested as an accessory if I spoke one word. Clara's voice broke on the last line. The paper fell from her hands. She began to weep. It was not the desperate, terrified sobbing of her nightmares. It was a deep, shuddering, cleansing rain. She wept for the girl who had been trapped, for the man who had died, for the months of terror, and for the simple, staggering, impossible fact that it was, finally, over. Grayson held her, his own eyes shut tight, as she cried herself empty. The next day, the sky was clear and cold, the first real snows dusting the high peaks. Clara took a small tin box from her trunk. Inside it, she placed the yellowed newspaper clipping. She placed the threatening letters she had received from Josiah Cunningham, the one that had driven her west. She walked alone, past the barn, past the creek, to a high ridge overlooking the ranch. The land was vast, harsh, and beautiful. It was no longer a prison. It was her home. She dug a small hole in the hard, cold earth with a trowel. She placed the box inside. She looked at it for a long time, the artifacts of her fear. Then she covered it with dirt and stones, burying the ghost of Harold Cunningham, burying the fugitive Clara Dawson. When she returned to the house, Grayson was waiting for her on the porch. She walked up to him, her face clean, her eyes clear. She was free. He let his body heal for 2 full weeks after the letter from Boston arrived. The wound in his side was a tight, puckered scar, a dull ache where there had been a fire. But the wound in his soul, the one made of arrogance and deception, had taken longer. He had watched her every day, watched the transformation. The fear had bled out of her, day by day, leaving behind a woman he was only just beginning to know. She was quiet, yes, but her silence was no longer a shield. It was a pool of calm strength. She smiled now, a slow, genuine smile that lit her gray eyes. She spoke with Jacob, the foreman, her questions about the herd sharp and intelligent. She had taken over the house accounts from the start, her ledgers neater and more accurate than any he had ever kept. She had healed him, and she had buried her past. But one thing remained, a ghost of an arrangement, a contract made by his sister, a mail-order bargain. It stood between them, a final, unaddressed shadow. He waited until a clear, cold afternoon, the sky a high, flawless blue. He found her in the stable, checking on the stallion that had carried him home, her hand stroking the horse's black velvet nose. "Clara," he said. She turned, her smile immediate. "You should be resting. Grayson, Jacob said you were walking the fence line." "I am tired of resting." He said, "Come, ride with me. There is a place I want to show you." He saddled her horse himself, a gentle mare, and they rode out, not toward the foothills of the cabin, but west, toward the high ridge. They rode in a comfortable silence, side by side. He was no longer Silas. She was no longer a fugitive. They were simply a man and a woman, on their own land. He dismounted at the crest, a place that overlooked the entire valley, the ranch house a small, solid square in the distance, his herd's dark specks on the golden grass. The wind was clean and cold, smelling of pine and distance. She dismounted and came to stand beside him, pulling her coat tighter. "This is where you came," he said. It was not a question. Her eyes widened slightly. "How did you know?" "I have seen you walk this way. This is where you buried the box." She nodded, her gaze sweeping the horizon. It seemed like the top of the world, a good place to leave things. He turned to face her. He took her hands. They were chapped from work, but strong. "I know how we started. Clara, it was a lie, my lie. I was a coward and a fool, and I almost lost you because of it." "Grayson, no." Let me say this. His grip tightened. That arrangement my sister made, that piece of paper, it means nothing. It is ash. It is as dead and buried as that clipping you put in the ground. What happened at the Miller Ranch? What happened in the barn? What happened in that cabin? That was real, but it was born from fear and desperation. I do not want that. He was stumbling over the words. This man who commanded 1,000 head of cattle and 24 men. I want a beginning that is clean. I want a choice. Your choice. My choice. Free and clear. He dropped to one knee. The movement pulled at his new scar. A sharp reminder, but he welcomed it. He looked up at her. This woman who had seen the absolute worst of him and had saved him anyway. Clara Dawson, he said, his voice rough. You are the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever known. You are my partner, and you are my heart. I am asking you, not as an arrangement, but as a man who is whole because of you. Will you marry me? She had not been breathing. She let out a small, sharp gasp. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. He saw the tears well in her eyes, but they were not the tears of terror he had seen in the barn. They were not the tears of grief she had shed in the cabin. They were tears of pure, unbridled joy. A trembling started in her hands, a relief so profound it shook her entire body. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking. She knelt in the dirt in front of him, her hands coming up to cup his face. Yes, Grayson, yes. He rose, pulling her up with him, and kissed her. A deep, slow kiss that held no desperation, no fear, no shadow of a lie. It was a kiss of promise, of truth, there on the top of the world, with the cold wind as their only witness. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright, cold Sunday in late November. The snows had not yet come to the valley, and the air was still. They did not go to the church in town. Grayson would not have it. He would not have a stranger consecrating what he and Clara had forged in fire and blood. He had the men clear the yard under the massive, bare-limbed cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the main house. Planks were set on barrels for benches. A traveling preacher, a stern-looking man named Elias, was paid $20 to make the ride out and perform the service. It was, as Grayson had intended, simple. Clara wore a new dress, a dark blue wool that Mrs. Miller had helped her sew. She wore no veil, no jewels. Her dark hair was simply brushed and pinned. Grayson stood beside her, his best suit feeling stiff and unfamiliar. He was aware of the scar beneath the cloth, a permanent part of him. The attendees were few, but they were the ones who mattered. Millie had ridden over from the Miller Ranch, her face set in a rare, grudging smile, her eyes suspiciously bright. She sat in the front row. Jacob and the other ranch hands stood in a rough semicircle, their hats in their hands, their hair slicked down with water. They looked uncomfortable and profoundly respectful. Arthur and Mrs. Miller were there, their presence a quiet, final closing of that first, terrible chapter. The preacher spoke of duty and hardship and the grace of God in the wilderness. But Grayson only watched Clara. When it came time for the vows, the preacher's voice faded. Grayson spoke, his voice clear and strong, carrying in the cold air. I choose you, Clara, before all others. In hardship and in prosperity, I will be your shield, and I will be your home, always. Clara's voice was softer, but no one missed a word. I choose you, Grayson, freely, with my whole heart. I will be your partner, and I will be your peace, always. When the preacher said, You may kiss your bride, Grayson did. A firm, proud kiss, and the hands erupted in cheers, their hats flying into the air. The celebration was not a Boston ball. It was a feast. 2 steers had been roasted. Barrels of beer were opened. A fiddle player Grayson had hired from Cheyenne struck up a tune, and the rough hands awkwardly took turns dancing with the bride. who laughed with a lightness that made Grayson's heart ache with joy. He watched her, his wife, moving with grace and confidence among his men. Millie came to stand beside him, a cup of cider in her hand.
She's a good one.
"Holt," Millie said, her gaze on Clara.
Tougher than she looks.
"She is," Grayson agreed. "You're a lucky fool. You almost lost her. You know, your arrogance, it's a sickness." Grayson nodded, accepting the judgment.
I know. Millie, thank you for looking after her, for talking to her.
Millie just grunted.
Someone had to. Don't break her. She's had enough of that.
She looked him up and down.
And you? Try not to get yourself knifed again. She's got better things to do than stitch you back together.
Clara's new life settled in, not like a placid pool, but like a river finding its proper course. The running was over, and the doing began. She was, as he had suspected, possessed of a sharp, orderly mind. She had been educated. She understood numbers. She took her place not in the kitchen, but in the study. Jacob, who had at first been wary of taking orders from a woman, found that Mrs. Holt understood the economics of a ranch better than half the men in Cheyenne. "The winter feed calculations are wrong, Jacob," she said one morning, her finger on a ledger. "You've accounted for 2,000 head, but you have not factored in the 30% loss we can expect if the snows are deep. As you predict, we need another 100 tons of hay, or we will be selling off yearlings at a loss come February." Jacob had stared, done the math in his head, and then slowly nodded. "Yes, ma'am, you're right. I'll send a man to the valley." She became his trusted partner. In truth, he found himself discussing everything with her, not just the books, but the land leases, the water rights, the hiring of new men. She was not just his wife. She was the co-ruler of his empire, and the empire flourished under their joint command. He, in turn, worked to heal the last, smallest shadows of her past. He knew the woman who ran his ledgers was also the woman who had read books in Boston. The woman who had saved a calf was the woman who had once, he imagined, known how to be quiet. That winter, he hired a team of carpenters, paying them triple wages to work through the cold. He had them enclose the wide, west-facing porch, a space that caught all the afternoon light. He had them install vast panes of glass, hauled at great expense from Denver. He had them build shelves, from floor to ceiling, and a fireplace, small and intimate. When they were done, he did not tell her. He just led her to the door one evening, just as the sun was setting. She opened it and stopped. The room was flooded with the dying, golden light of the prairie. The shelves were filled. He had sent an order to a bookseller in San Francisco. Poetry, novels, history, philosophy. In the center of the room was a single, comfortable chair and a small writing desk. It was a room of quiet, a room of peace, a room that was just for her. She turned to him, her eyes shining. She did not need to say a word. He had seen the last ghost of Boston, and he had given it a home. Spring came, and the land turned green. The herds were strong. Clara was no longer the pale, haunted woman in a gray dress. She had color in her cheeks. She rode beside him, not on a borrowed mule, but on the fine mare he had given her. She wore practical split skirts, her hair tied back, her gaze as sharp as his, watching the horizon. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer afraid. She was the mistress of all she surveyed. One evening, they sat before the great fireplace in the main room. It was late. The ranch was silent. A log popped, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. She had been quiet for a long time, watching the flames. He was reading a report from Cheyenne, but he was more aware of her presence than of the words on the page. She reached out, her fingers light, and traced the line of his scar through his shirt. He stopped reading. "You risked your life to protect mine," she said, her voice a low murmur. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a marvel she was still turning over in her mind. He put the report down and covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm flat against the healed wound. He looked at her, at the woman who had stitched him together, the woman who ran his ranch, the woman who filled his house with a quiet, powerful light. "You gave me a reason to live again," he replied. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm silence. The past finally settled, the future theirs to make. The next morning, they rose before the sun, as was their habit. They stood on the porch of the main house, cups of hot coffee in their hands. The sky to the east was a pale, cold gray, just beginning to burn with a line of violent orange. The air was sharp, promising another hard day of work, of life. Grayson's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, a familiar, solid warmth. He looked at her. She was not watching him. She was watching the sun breach the horizon, her face calm, resolute, and free. She was no longer a refugee from the East. He was no longer a prisoner of his own empty wealth. The past, with its ghosts and its guilt, was behind them. The wild, beautiful, harsh land spread out before them, and it was, at last, their shared home. Thank you for listening to The Rancher Posed as a Farmhand to Watch His Bride-to-Be. This was a long one, and I appreciate you sticking with us. Where in the world are you listening from? We would love to know. Go ahead and drop your city or country in the comments. Your thoughts mean everything to us, so please share them in English. What did you think of Grayson's deception? And what about Clara's final choice? If you enjoyed this story, please be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of love, survival, and redemption on the American frontier.